Most people think of sports as simply a form of entertainment, an escape from reality. But what are we escaping from when we watch sports? When we look at the media coverage and the lack of coverage of women's sports, what we're escaping from is a world in which women are equal to men. You might be surprised to hear this. In fact, last year, the news media proclaimed it as the year of the woman in sports. This was in part because of the tremendous and impressive accomplishments of female athletes that year, including the U.S. women's soccer team winning the World Cup for the first time since 1999. Yes, woo! The broadcast of the final game generated higher television ratings than the World Series, the Stanley Cup Finals, or the NBA Finals. Serena Williams appeared on the cover of Sports Illustrated as Sports Illustrated's Sportsperson of the Year. Ronda Rousey, a trailblazer for women in mixed martial arts, won the ESPY Award for Best Female Athlete. Caitlyn Jenner also won an ESPY Award for Courage for bringing trans visibility and trans inclusion into the world of sports. Jennifer Welter made headlines and history by becoming the first woman to coach in the NFL. Now, you might be thinking, these stories sound positive, celebrating female athletes and women's sports. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem with designating a given year as the year of women in sports sends the message to viewers and to audiences that women's sports are somehow special, out of the ordinary, and not a part of the everyday. I mean, think about it. When was the last time you heard the news media proclaiming a given year as the year of men in sports? Well, we probably don't hear that because that would be every year, so it wouldn't really be a good media story, right? But the year of women in sports is also problematic because it lets the news media off the hook. It gives them a pass from engaging in a sustained and systematic coverage of women's sports. In a longitudinal study I've conducted with my colleague, Mike Messner at the University of Southern California, we found in the 25-year period that we studied a decline in the coverage of women's sports. And in fact, the news media and the sports media spent less time in 2014 covering women's sports than they did in 1989 when the study first began. Of the 934 stories on the local affiliates that we looked at, that we studied, 880 stories were on men's sports, while only 32 stories were on women's. ESPN SportsCenter, which is one of the most popular programs that covers sports, spent only 376 of the 405 stories talking about men's sports, while only looking at women's sports in 13 stories. So you might be thinking, you see these numbers, and maybe they're not all surprising to you, maybe they are, but for those of you that might expect this, some of you might have expected these numbers because you might be thinking, well, men's sports are more popular than women's sports, so of course the news media, SportsCenter are going to spend more time talking about men's sports than women's sports. You might be thinking they're more popular, there are more opportunities to cover men's sports. This might make sense to you. So we figured you might be saying that, and so what we did then is we took this data and broke it down a little bit further, and we looked at a sport where both men and women participate during the same time frame at the same level, college basketball. And what we found wasn't much different. When we looked at the coverage of collegiate basketball in our sample, the local affiliates spent 120 stories, or about 90 minutes, talking about the men's tournament, the men's NCAA tournament, while only focusing 9 stories, or a paltry 3.5 minutes, covering the women's tournament. And this was despite the fact that in the local affiliate, several local teams had made it to the tournament. ESPN SportsCenter, numbers weren't that much better. 83 stories on the men's tournament, representing nearly 2.5 hours of coverage, with only 8 stories, or about 9.5 minutes, focusing on the women's tournament. Now, this type of coverage isn't just contained, and these kind of disparities that we're seeing isn't just contained or confined to these big sporting events like the NCAA March Madness tournament. And in fact, what we found was that the news media covered men's sports, and in particular the men's big three, so men's basketball, football, and baseball, regardless of whether or not it was in season. And so men's sports, and in particular those three men's sports, represented 75% of our total sample. These sports were oftentimes the lead story of the day, and in fact, 100% of the broadcasts that we looked at started out with a story of men's sports, regardless of whether or not that sport was in season. So what we learned from commentators is that it's never too early, too soon, or too late to talk about men's sports. During the month of March, the local affiliate, on a day where they spent no time, zero time talking about women's sports, devoted 20 seconds to a story about a 18-inch corn dog that you could purchase at the Arizona Diamondback Stadium for $25. Also during the month of March, a local affiliate, again, this is a day where no coverage of women's sports happened during the broadcast, despite the fact that the NCAA tournament and several other high-profile women's events were taking place. The local affiliate spent 55 seconds on a story about a stray dog named Hank, who had wandered into the Milwaukee Brewers Stadium. He was subsequently named Hank, I should say. That wasn't his name. He's a stray dog. He has no name, right? But he comes into the stadium, and he's embraced by the fans and players, and they have an online voting to decide what's his name going to be. This is 55 seconds within the local broadcast. Again, on a day where there's no coverage of women's sports. Now, I'm a dog owner. I should say I'm the proud parent of 2 puppies myself. So I love stories about dogs and stray dogs finding homes. It's a tear-jerker and heart-wrenching, very powerful story, perhaps. I'm hard-pressed to say, though, that a story about a stray dog should somehow trump one of the biggest sporting events in the sports world, and in particular, women's sports, right? So what we're seeing here, or I hope we're seeing, is that it's not important the amount of time that the media spend talking about men's sports versus women's sports, but it also matters how. So one of the things that we did was we looked at the commentary as well. How is it that, what are they saying about men's and women's sports? How are they reporting on men's and women's sports? And what we found were really stark differences between how commentators delivered stories about men's sports versus how they delivered stories about women's sports. So watching a story about men's sports was akin to watching the classic 1960s television show Batman with the bow and the Pam. So men's sporting events were described as a battle, a thriller. Male athletes threw down the dunk, ripped a double. Male athletes were going full throttle. Male athletes and their performances were described as sensational, picture perfect, incredible, unbelievable. Male athletes were a rock star and spectacular. Women's stories, on the other hand, were delivered in a much different tone, very matter-of-fact, bland delivery. Congratulations to the women of Troy tonight, who learned that they are a 9th seed in the women's basketball tournament. They'll play St. John's in the first round. Now, this ambivalent delivery is part of a larger strategy by which the sports media trivialize women's sports. Last year, after the US Open, when Serena Williams experienced a shocking and surprising loss during the final match, in the standard post-game press conference, a sports journalist asked Serena, "Why aren't you smiling?" And this was her response. "To be perfectly honest with you, I don't want to be here," she said. "I just want to be in bed right now, and I have to wake up early for practice. And I don't want to answer any of these questions. And you guys keep asking me the same questions. It's not really, you're not making it super enjoyable, just being honest." Now this and other egregious exchanges with female athletes led to the social media campaign, #CoverTheAthlete. And part of this campaign, the organization produced a video. And the video asked the question, what if sports journalists and what if journalists treated male athletes like they do female athletes?
You're getting a lot of fans here. A lot of them are female, and they want to know if you could date anyone in the world. Who would you date?
Any response to recent comments about your girlish figure?
Are you serious?
Removing your body hair gives you an edge in the pool. How about your love life?
How has your weight gain affected your mobility?
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about.
Have you heard the controversy over your helmet hair?
Get ready to see some great biceps, tiny tanks, and more.
I wonder if his dad said to him when he was younger, listen, you're never going to be a Looker, you're never going to be a Beckham, so you have to compensate for that.
He really does have the kind of body international judges love.
Could you give us a twirl and tell us about your outfit?
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man? Bro, I'm out, man.
Can you give us a twirl and tell us about your outfit?
A twirl, like...
A twirl, a pirouette. Here we go.
And although Serena Williams appeared on the cover of Sports Illustrated as the Sports Person of the Year, this was not without controversy. In fact, sports fans and Sports Illustrated readers were disappointed with the selection of Serena Williams. They thought that Triple Crown contender and Kentucky Derby winner American Pharoah was more deserving of the award. Yes, you heard me right. Sports fans thought that a horse was more deserving of the Sports Person of the Year award. Further contributing to this controversy was the fact that only 8 women and 1 women's sport team in the entire history of the magazine had been selected for this particular honor. This, along with the cover itself, sparked discussions and debates around the sexualization of female athletes in the media, as well as the overall lack of coverage of female athletes, particularly within Sports Illustrated. A recent study that looked at covers of the magazine between the years of 2000 and 2011 found that 35 out of 716 covers featured a female athlete. Of those 35 covers, only 11 featured female athletes depicted in poses similar to those of male athletes. So there's a stark difference between how we see female athletes on the field versus how we see them in the media. And in fact, given the overall lack of coverage of women's sports in the media, we're more likely to see female athletes in their bikini than on the field in action. And the messages that are sent to viewers in these images differ in very dramatic ways. So when we see images of female athletes on the court, on the field, in action, in uniform, that's much different than compared to how we see female athletes on the cover of Sports Illustrated versus how we see female athletes in the swimsuit issue. How do each of these images make you feel about women's sports and about female athletes? Are the messages that are sent in these images the same? Are they different? And if so, how? Child right advocate and founder and president of the Children's Defense Fund, Marian Wright Elderman said, "You can't be what you can't see." Now, of course, women and girls are participating in sport in spite of the lack of media coverage. The point here is that positive images of female athletes and of women's sports sends a powerful message to girls and women, and more importantly, boys and men, that we value women's sports in our society. And this is something that we should want to support in our girls. According to the Women's Sport Foundation, there are a whole host of social, psychological, educational, and health benefits when girls participate in sport. And in fact, those benefits don't just stop when girls become women. In fact, a recent study found that 96% of women in C-suite level positions had some sport background, 52% of them having played sport at the university level, compared to 39% of their counterparts in other managerial positions. 74% of executive women interviewed agreed that having a background in sport could help accelerate a woman's leadership and career potential. So the correlation between sport participation and positive outcomes for girls and women cannot be denied. Now, the media will say, well, we don't cover sports because it's simply a matter of supply and demand. We're just giving viewers what they want to see. And viewers aren't interested in women's sports. What I hope I've shown today is how the media create demand as much as they meet it. But let's just take a second here and assume that the sports media and media are correct, that they are just meeting a demand, and that people aren't interested in watching or learning about women's sports. If that's the case, then why? And what is the answer to that question? Tell us about how we as a culture value female athletes and what we think about the role and the status of women in our society. Thank you.